Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a particularly dreary morning in the autumn of 1896 that this most curious affair commenced. London lay beneath a blanket of thick and sullen fog, pressing against the window panes of 221B Baker Street, like some ghostly hand. The gas lamps flickered uncertainly along the street below, casting pale reflections upon the slick cobblestones. I had arrived early, drawn by a letter from Holmes, though I found no indication as to why my presence was required. The air inside was scented faintly with tobacco and the lingering traces of some chemical experiment Holmes had abandoned hours before. It was, I realized, to be one of those mornings where fate would place an unsuspecting visitor at the heart of a chilling mystery. Holmes stood at the window, his long fingers drumming soundlessly against the glass, his sharp gaze cutting through the mist as though attempting to decipher some coded message hidden within it. His dressing gown, a dishevelled robe of grey, hung loosely over his lean frame, and his fingertips bore the unmistakable stains of recent chemical inquiry. There was a curious energy about him, a restlessness that often preceded the arrival of some peculiar case capable of captivating his mercurial mind. I had scarcely settled into my chair when Holmes turned sharply, as though hearing footsteps neither of us could yet perceive. Mrs. Hudson had barely placed our breakfast tray upon the table when the sharp knock came at the door, urgent, trembling, yet somehow hesitant. Before I could rise, Holmes had already called out for our visitor to enter, his keen senses having evidently anticipated the intrusion. The woman who stepped into our sitting room was cloaked in a heavy veil, her hands clasped tightly around a small velvet bundle which she carried against her chest with the fierce protectiveness of one guarding a treasure or concealing a curse. Her gloves were damp, her breathing uneven, and her posture spoke of grief sharpened into fear. Our breakfast was instantly forgotten. Holmes's eyes swept over her in a single, piercing glance, the way a naturalist might observe a rare specimen in motion. Without so much as a word exchanged, I saw his lips twitch with the satisfaction of a deduction already formed. "You have only just returned from the continent," he said, "and your journey was both hurried and reluctant. Your morning attire is not tailored to you, but borrowed, perhaps from a sister or close friend. And the scent upon your gloves suggests you travelled in the close company of a maid who favours lilac water." The woman started, her trembling hands tightening around the velvet bundle. With a shuddering breath, our visitor lowered herself into the chair opposite Holmes. Wordlessly, she began to unwrap the velvet from the object she carried, her fingers lingering upon each fold, as though reluctant to reveal the final layer. The cloth fell away to reveal a delicate cut-glass goblet, exquisite in its craftsmanship, its surface catching the light like a diamond upon dark silk. But there was something ominous in its beauty, as though the glass itself had absorbed the whisper of a terrible secret. Even Holmes's gaze lingered a moment longer than usual. For an instant, the languor and dissatisfaction which had clouded Holmes's features all morning evaporated. In its place, I saw the familiar glint, the gleam of a mind suddenly alight with curiosity, challenged by a puzzle worthy of its full powers. "I believe, Watson," he murmured, "that our breakfast must wait. Something tells me this particular glass has held far more than wine." I knew then. The game was afoot. The veil was drawn back, revealing a pale and handsome face, though time and trouble had traced their delicate lines upon it. "I am Lady Helena Marbury," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of recent grief. "My husband, Sir Charles Marbury, passed from this world only a fortnight ago, under circumstances I cannot accept." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his gaze neither sympathetic nor cold, but alive with interest. The name was not unfamiliar to me. Sir Charles had served in several delicate diplomatic missions in his time, earning both distinction and, inevitably, enemies. That his widow now sat before us, clutching a glass wrapped in velvet, hinted that his death was more than a matter for the obituary columns. Holmes's fingers steepled, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes glinted sharply. Lady Helena's hands trembled as she recounted the fatal evening. It had been a small private dinner at their home in Kensington, no more than 5 guests, including Sir Charles's old friend, Sir Malcolm Kent. The conversation had been light, the courses unremarkable, and the wine, a gift from a foreign acquaintance, had flowed freely. "It was after the final toast," she said, her voice faltering. Sir Charles lifted his glass to his lips. He took a single sip, no more. And then, her fingers clenched the velvet. He made a sound, a strangled sort of gasp, and collapsed across the table. The household physician, summoned in haste, could do nothing. Sir Charles was dead within minutes. Yet when the table was cleared, the glass from which he had drunk remained intact, neither cracked nor shattered. It was as though death had risen from within the glass itself. "I cannot explain it," she whispered. "But I know. It was that glass." Holmes leaned forward, fingers interlocked, his gaze fixed not on Lady Helena's face, but upon the velvet bundle in her lap. "This glass," he said quietly. "You brought it with you." She placed it upon the table with reverence, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a slender goblet, its crystal surface unmarked and gleaming. I confess, I had expected to see some crack or stain, some visible mark of its murderous history. Yet it was pristine. "It was my first thought," she said, "that it would have shattered in his hand. That poison, if it were poison, would corrode or break the crystal. But it survived, as if untouched." Holmes's fingers hovered above it, his expression one of both admiration and suspicion, as though the glass were no mere object, but a witness reluctant to speak. "Poison, however, was not the conclusion of the attending physician," Lady Helena continued. "He recorded the cause as heart failure, a natural end for a man of my husband's years." Holmes's brow lifted faintly. "Natural, you say?" She coloured slightly, but pressed on. "Sir Charles had no history of illness. He was robust for his age, and in excellent spirits that evening." Her lips tightened. The physician was eager to avoid scandal or inquiry, and so the matter was closed before it had properly begun. Holmes gave a soft hum, neither approval nor disagreement. It was, after all, a tidy resolution, too tidy for my friend's liking. The glass, however, stood as silent rebuttal to that comfortable diagnosis. Holmes' eyes flickered over Lady Helena's attire, the worn hem of her gloves, the faint stress line on her left sleeve, the absence of a wedding band. "You did not dine together often, I think," he remarked. She stiffened slightly. "That is correct." "Your mourning clothes are new but poorly fitted. A loan from someone close, perhaps a sister. The faint shine on your boots suggests travel, not a leisurely journey but one made in haste. And you are accustomed to solitude, I gather." She stared at him, half indignant, half awed. "How could you—" "Your veil was pinned carelessly by your own hand. A lady accustomed to companionship would have called upon her maid. It is all perfectly plain." As always, his deductions left me marvelling at the effortless grace with which he peeled back the private layers of a person's life. Lady Helena, however, seemed less astonished than dismayed, as though Holmes had come uncomfortably close to some private sorrow. Holmes's nostrils flared slightly. "The perfume on your gloves," he observed. "It is not your own." Lady Helena frowned. "It belongs to my maid, I believe. She discovered Sir Charles that night. She held me after. My gloves must have touched hers. Holmes nodded, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Lilac water, he murmured. A provincial choice. Your maid is not a Londoner. She is from Kent, Lady Helena confirmed, though she looked uncertain as to its relevance. To my eye, it was an inconsequential detail, but I had learned long ago that Holmes's net gathered every scrap, no matter how small. He turned the glass in his hands, his expression serene, though I could sense his mind racing like a thoroughbred under a calm rider's hand. Tell me, Holmes said suddenly, where did this glass originate? Lady Helena hesitated. It was a gift, part of a set, sent to Sir Charles several months ago. There was no name attached. No name? Holmes echoed, his fingers tracing the delicate stem. No card. Only a note, she said, her voice faltering. It read, "To drink is to remember." I saw Holmes's gaze sharpen. There was something about the phrase, a cadence, perhaps, that struck some chord in his encyclopedic memory. And Sir Charles recognized no handwriting. Number it was printed, typewritten. A most modern form of anonymity, Holmes murmured. And the other glasses, still in your possession? She shook her head. Sir Charles was superstitious. After his death, I had them destroyed. Holmes's smile flickered, amused perhaps at the widow's fear, or at the tantalizing fragments of mystery falling into place. You need not fear, Lady Helena, Holmes said at last. The matter will be resolved. She opened her mouth, as if to ask how, but something in his expression stopped her. There was a glint in his eye, that dangerous gleam which I had come to associate with his greatest cases. The widow departed, leaving only silence in her wake. Holmes's fingers drummed softly upon the table, each tap a heartbeat in the growing tension. Shall we, Watson? He said lightly. I believe the game has just become most entertaining. As we stood together at the window, watching Lady Helena's carriage disappear into the fog, I glanced at Holmes. There was no mistaking the change in him. The lethargy of the morning was gone, replaced by keen anticipation. She hides something, I said quietly. Naturally, Holmes replied. Everyone does. He turned, his smile faint but unmistakable. But I fancy this particular glass has held more than wine, Watson. It has held secrets. And secrets, as you know, are my particular passion. I felt that familiar thrill. The case had begun, and I, once again, was swept along in its current. The Marbury residence was precisely the kind of house that seemed to brood upon its own secrets. The windows stared blankly upon us as Holmes and I stepped through the iron gate, and the faint odour of damp earth clung to the air, the scent of a house in mourning. The butler, a thin man with a haunted aspect, admitted us without ceremony. I noticed Holmes's eyes flicking from the creased black armband upon his sleeve to the scuffed brass at the door, as though tallying the household state with a glance. The drawing-room retained the marks of hasty rearrangement, as though the servants had banished reminders of the fatal dinner. The very air seemed to hush at our entry, and I could not shake the sense that the walls themselves had witnessed something unspeakable. Holmes stood a moment in perfect stillness, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to the silence for its secrets. Holmes began his questioning with that peculiar gentleness he reserved for nervous witnesses, a softness that made the servants speak not out of duty, but out of relief. Bit by bit, their hesitant words formed a mosaic of quiet dread. The cook confessed that Sir Charles had been ill at ease for weeks before the dinner. His usual appetite diminished, his temper quick to flare. A footman recalled that the master had received several peculiar parcels, none addressed in familiar handwriting, and that Sir Charles had burned the wrappings before anyone could examine them. The maid who had attended the dinner, a round-faced girl trembling under Holmes's gaze, remembered the unsettling atmosphere that evening. How Sir Charles had glanced repeatedly at the door, as though expecting an unwelcome guest. But there was no one uninvited, Holmes asked. No, sir, she whispered, but it felt as though someone else was there. Holmes tapped his fingers softly against the mantelpiece. Fear rarely walks alone, he said. It keeps company with guilt or knowledge, sometimes both. It was the parlour maid who, at last, produced the piece of the puzzle Holmes had been waiting for, the story of the anonymous gift. A month prior, a parcel had arrived for Sir Charles, unannounced and unaccompanied by any calling card. The box contained a set of 6 crystal goblets, exquisitely crafted, their stems delicately twisted as though spun from frost itself. With the glasses lay a single slip of paper bearing the cryptic words, "To drink is to remember." I found him staring at them, the maid recalled. He looked, I can't quite explain it, sir, as though he knew something terrible had caught up with him at last. Holmes's brow lifted, his fingers tightening briefly around the lapel of his coat, a gesture I had come to recognize as the scent of genuine intrigue. And the handwriting. It was typed, she said, cold and impersonal. Holmes glanced at me. A message with no voice, Watson. A ghost that speaks from nowhere. With the servants dismissed, Holmes paced the room, reconstructing the final dinner with the ease of a man assembling a puzzle he had solved before. There were 5 guests, he said. Sir Charles, his wife, Sir Malcolm Kent, and 2 lesser-known men, both tied to diplomatic circles. He paused beside the chair at the head of the table, where Sir Charles had sat, and ran his hand along the polished wood. Sir Malcolm Kent, Holmes continued, was seated directly across. A curious man, and a vanishing one. Did you know, Watson, that Sir Malcolm disappeared from London the morning after Sir Charles's death? Vanished? I echoed. Quite so. Left his club before dawn, no forwarding address, no explanation. The official account speaks of sudden illness requiring country air, but the truth is simpler, and uglier. And what truth is that? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. The kind that prefers darkness to daylight, the same truth, I suspect, that delivered these glasses, and now leaves us to hunt a man who no longer wishes to be found. Holmes wasted no time in directing our cab to the Corinthian Club, a well-known sanctuary for retired diplomats, foreign agents, and those whose professional lives had long since blended into shadow. It was a club Holmes had infiltrated once before, though the story of how he acquired his honorary membership was one I had never been permitted to write. The club's steward, an elderly man with the alert caution of a lifelong servant to dangerous men, recognized Holmes instantly and allowed us entry without question. Holmes walked the hall with the unerring confidence of a man who knew exactly where the truth had been hidden. Sir Malcolm was seen here the day before the dinner, Holmes remarked, in company with a man who arrived under no name at all. A foreigner, I asked. That depends entirely, Holmes said, on one's definition of foreign. Sometimes, Watson, the greatest strangers are those we once knew best. The steward coughed discreetly. A letter arrived for Sir Malcolm that very night, Mr. Holmes. Would you care to see it? Holmes's smile was thin and satisfied. I thought you'd never ask. Before we departed the Marbury residence, Holmes insisted upon inspecting the dining room by candlelight. Though I could see little purpose in the exercise, I had learned that Holmes's methods often revealed treasures invisible to the ordinary eye. He lit a single candle and placed it at the center of the table, observing the angle of the flame and the direction of its shadow. Slowly, he walked the room, his gaze low, tracing the outlines of the table's edge and the faint marks left by the guests' glasses and plates. Then, with the softest exclamation, Holmes bent and retrieved a single droplet of hardened wax from the floor beside Sir Charles's chair. This, he said, holding it aloft, is how we know where Sir Charles truly sat, and who sat beside him. But surely Lady Helena told us the seating arrangement, I objected. She told us her memory of it, Holmes replied. But memory, my dear Watson, is the most treacherous of witnesses. Wax, however, is incapable of lying. Holmes pocketed the wax fragment and led me briskly back to Baker Street, where he sank into his armchair with the air of a man unraveling a particularly elegant knot. His pipe glowed faintly as he stared into the fire. "Sir Malcolm Kent did not vanish," Holmes said at length. "He fled." "From what?" I asked. "From the consequence of his own hand," Holmes replied. "He knew precisely what that glass contained, and for whom it was intended." I started. "Do you mean that the glass was prepared not for Sir Charles, but for Sir Malcolm himself?" Holmes's smile was devoid of humour. "I fancy our missing diplomat found himself seated precisely where the poisoner expected his victim to sit, and that a last-minute alteration in the seating spared him." "And condemned Sir Charles instead," I said softly. "Precisely." I shook my head, both horrified and fascinated. "But who then sent the glasses?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "That, Watson, is the question which will lead us directly into the heart of this affair." Holmes's interest sharpened considerably when the butler produced a small leather-bound ledger, the visitor record of Sir Charles's final weeks. It revealed, to my surprise, that both Sir Charles and Sir Malcolm Kent had visited the Corinthian Club with unusual frequency before the dinner. The Corinthian was no ordinary gentleman's club. Its reputation for quiet discretion attracted diplomats, spies, and those who navigated the murky waters between them. Holmes, having once infiltrated its inner circle under a false name, spoke of it with a mixture of admiration and contempt. "An establishment," he said, "where treaties are born, alliances crumble, and the odd scandal is swept quietly beneath Persian carpets." Sir Charles and Sir Malcolm had entered the club together on the evening prior to the fatal dinner. When they left, they were no longer speaking. "Two men leave the same door," Holmes observed, "but only one survives the following evening. You see the shape forming, Watson." "What quarrel could divide old friends so completely?" I asked. Holmes's smile was razor-thin. "The kind where survival is at stake. Come, Watson, the table itself will tell us the rest." Holmes insisted upon returning to the dining room where Sir Charles had fallen. There, with a methodical calm, he lit a candle and placed it at the exact centre of the table, studying the flickering reflection upon the polished mahogany. The servants watched in mystification as he adjusted its position by mere fractions of an inch, observing how its light fell across the places where the guests had sat. "An ill-kept secret," he murmured, "is often betrayed by the simplest witness." He bent suddenly, extracting from the floor a single droplet of hardened wax, a minor accident during the dinner had anyone noticed at the time. "This candle stood beside Sir Charles," Holmes said. "The wax fell only at his seat, and not where Lady Helena claimed he had sat." "What does that signify?" I asked. "It signifies," Holmes said, straightening, "that the seating arrangement was altered at the last moment. Someone switched places. And it is that switch, Watson, which turned the assassin's hand against the wrong man." The discovery of the candle wax left Holmes in no doubt that Sir Malcolm Kent's sudden disappearance was not the act of a coward, but a man fleeing the shadow of his own guilt. "Sir Malcolm was the intended victim," Holmes declared as we stood together in the fading light of the drawing room. "The poisoned glass had been prepared for his hand, not Sir Charles. But a careless moment, perhaps as simple as pulling out the wrong chair, sealed the fate of his friend instead." "Then Sir Malcolm fled because he knew what the glass contained?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "He recognized the danger only after the deed was done. Guilt, fear, and a healthy instinct for self-preservation did the rest. If my suspicion is correct, we shall find that Sir Malcolm's disappearance was no act of mourning. It was the panicked flight of a man who believed he was next." I could not suppress a shiver at the thought that a glass, so delicate and ordinary, could carry death so silently into the hands of either man. As Holmes gathered these threads with effortless precision, I found myself increasingly troubled. There was something in his manner, some private amusement or unspoken certainty, that suggested he had known far more than he had shared with me thus far. "Holmes," I ventured, "there's a part of this you haven't yet explained." He gave me one of his rare, knowing smiles. My dear Watson, if I told you everything at once, what would keep you entertained? It was his usual deflection, playful on the surface, yet shielding something colder beneath. For the first time, I wondered if Holmes was not merely solving a case, but testing something deeper. Holmes turned the crystal glass over in his hands once more, the candlelight catching its every edge and facet. It is a curious thing, Watson, he said, almost to himself. We have names, motives, and fear enough to drown a dozen men, yet this glass remains silent. It has no memory, no confession to offer. Then where does that leave us? I asked. Precisely where I prefer to be, Holmes replied. On the threshold of certainty, with just enough darkness left to make the journey worthwhile. Even now, I could sense his mind leaping ahead, beyond the facts I could yet grasp. As we stepped once more into the gathering dusk, Holmes paused at the threshold of the Marbury house, casting a single glance back at the dining room. What do you see? I asked. A house that mourns a diplomat, he said, but hides the death of a conspirator. He walked on without further explanation, leaving me to ponder his meaning in silence. Holmes often spoke in riddles when the solution was nearly at hand. It was both his amusement and his way of teaching me to think like him. But that night, I feared the lesson would come at a terrible cost. The morning after our return from the Marbury residence, Holmes dispatched 3 telegrams before breakfast. By noon, we were seated across from a portly French antiquarian named Monsieur Fournier, whose London office, it appeared, existed solely to trace forgotten European artisans for the benefit of wealthy collectors. Merceau, Holmes said, folding his hands neatly before him. What can you tell me of that name? Monsieur Fournier's brows lifted, and he leaned back, as if summoned into some unpleasant memory. Merceau, glassworks. Holmes inclined his head. Mon Dieu, said Fournier, shaking his head. A ghost of French industry, long buried. Their work was exquisite, and forbidden. Forbidden? I asked. Fournier's smile was thin. They made ceremonial glassware for courts and secret societies, but they were best known for, how do you say, le verre de la mort, the glass of death. Holmes's fingers drummed softly upon the table. And such glasses, if one still existed. Fournier shrugged. Then someone, monsieur, has awakened a ghost. Holmes rose abruptly, his smile like the edge of a blade. Come, Watson. We have unearthed the maker. Now let us discover its purpose. It was in the dim reading room of the British Museum that Holmes, with his usual disregard for official channels, procured a fragile ledger of banned European artifacts, its pages yellowed with age and disapproval. Within its spine lay the dark history of Merceau Glassworks. Founded in 1785, Merceau had begun as a conventional glassmaker, supplying tableware to minor French nobility. But under its second master, the firm acquired a sinister reputation, crafting ceremonial goblets for shadowy diplomatic circles, glasses deliberately infused with poisons concealed within the crystal itself. These were not mere drinking vessels, Watson, Holmes murmured, tracing a finger down a sketched design identical to the Marbury glass. They were weapons masquerading as elegance. A guest lifts the glass to toast, and with each sip, death meets his lips. Such craftsmanship, I said, shuddering, has no place in civilized society. Holmes gave a soft, sardonic laugh. On the contrary, my dear Watson, civilized society is precisely where such artistry thrives. The only difference is whether one poisons with a glass or a signature. With the history of Merceau established, Holmes turned his attention to the fatal mechanism itself. In our sitting room at Baker Street, beneath the unflinching glare of Holmes's microscope, the glass yielded its final secret. Observe the inner lip, Watson, he said. See that faint opalescence beneath the surface. That is not a flaw in the crystal. It is a layer of arsenical resin fused into the glass during its cooling. I stared, horrified. Then the poison was not in the wine at all. Precisely. said Holmes. The heat of the drinker's lips would activate the resin, releasing minute quantities of toxin directly into the bloodstream through the mouth. I sat back, cold with the realization. A man could taste nothing, sense nothing, and within minutes, be dead, Holmes concluded, almost cheerfully. Mersault's work was legendary for precisely this subtlety. The weapon leaves no trace, because the glass itself is the assassin. Holmes spun the goblet between his fingers like a conjurer, his eyes alight with grim satisfaction. Ingenious, is it not? It was characteristic of Holmes that, even as we uncovered this ancient horror, his mind leapt forward to Lady Helena herself. The widow had seemed genuinely shaken, but Holmes had long ago taught me that grief and guilt often wear the same mask. Lady Helena Marbury, he said that evening, reclining with fingers steepled. Born Helena Valford, educated in Geneva. Geneva, I repeated. Holmes's smile sharpened. Where, curiously, she pursued studies in applied chemistry before her marriage to Sir Charles, I started. Chemistry, you means motive and opportunity, Holmes said briskly. A husband's career forged in delicate negotiations, a wife trained in the precise handling of toxins and compounds, and a glass, from an anonymous source, requiring uncommon knowledge to understand its true nature. Do you believe she poisoned him? I asked. Holmes shrugged. Belief is premature, but I believe that Lady Helena knows far more than she confessed, and if there is anything I cherish, Watson, it is a reluctant witness. With that, he stretched for his violin, leaving me to wonder how deep Lady Helena's secrets truly ran. Holmes's next move led us to a discreet archivist in Whitehall, a man with the nervous hands of someone who had spent his career handling secrets best left undisturbed. Holmes required only a name, Helena Valford, Lady Marbury's maiden identity. Within minutes, the archivist produced a thin but damning dossier. Lady Helena, it transpired, had once been an ardent supporter of the Liberty Circle, a radical group violently opposed to Britain's colonial diplomacy, a cause in which Sir Charles had been a leading architect. She had attended demonstrations, written inflammatory pamphlets, and even been arrested at a protest in her youth. Her marriage to Sir Charles had marked her public withdrawal from such activities, but it seemed old loyalties had not entirely died. One particularly chilling entry noted Lady Helena's early fascination with chemical methods of resistance, including poisons derived from rare minerals. Curious, is it not? Holmes remarked. A woman versed in chemistry, married to a diplomat she once despised, and the one object she brings us is a poisoned glass. For once, even I found no words to counter his implication. The more Holmes revealed, the more uneasy I became. I had pitied Lady Helena from the moment she crossed our threshold, veiled and trembling. Yet now I found myself wondering, had her tears been for love lost, or for a plan undone? She spoke of fear, I said. But fear of what? The glass itself, or of being found out? Holmes tapped his fingers idly against the arm of his chair. That, my dear Watson, is precisely what I intend to discover. I tried to dismiss the growing suspicion, but the pieces would not settle comfortably in my mind. Lady Helena's nervousness, her reluctance to part with the glass, even her selective account of the dinner, all seemed less like grief and more like calculated performance. She knew more than she told us, I muttered. Undoubtedly, said Holmes. The question is whether her silence killed her husband, or whether it merely left fate to choose between two enemies. His words hung heavy in the air, and my sympathy for Lady Helena grew colder by the minute. Holmes had, of course, quietly set his irregular network into motion days earlier. Street boys, club porters, and discreet informants all stirred into activity with a handful of sovereigns and the promise of Holmes's peculiar favour. By the third evening, their efforts bore fruit. One of Holmes's agents recovered a hidden cache of letters, discarded hastily at a lodging house once occupied by Sir Malcolm Kent before his disappearance. Holmes read them aloud to me, his voice growing sharper with each line. They were coded correspondences, exchanged between Sir Malcolm and a certain A.R., an alias Holmes immediately identified as belonging to a foreign agent known for meddling in British negotiations abroad. The letters alluded to a delicate operation involving a gift intended to restore balance at the Marbury dinner. Sir Malcolm was no mere guest, Holmes said grimly. He was either an accomplice to the sender or the intended target. Then the glass, I began. Was part of the operation, Holmes finished. The only question left is whether Lady Helena knew or merely hoped. Holmes laid the facts before me in his usual methodical fashion, building the narrative from fragments until the shape of truth emerged. According to the servants' accounts, Sir Charles had originally intended to sit at the far end of the table, leaving Sir Malcolm to occupy the place of honour, directly across from Lady Helena. Yet somewhere between the first and second course, Sir Charles had shifted places, claiming the light from the chandelier was too harsh at his intended seat. The change was casual, insignificant to all, except to whoever had prepared the poisoned glass. Imagine, Watson, Holmes said, his smile both grim and gleeful, a plot so precise it hinges upon the location of a single chair, and fate upends it with the simplest rearrangement. So Sir Charles drank what was meant for Sir Malcolm? I asked. Exactly. The hand that delivered the glass was not guided by knowledge but by habit, placing it at the seat intended for the traitor. It was a mistake as fatal to the conspirators as it was to Sir Charles himself. It was Holmes's final theory, and to me the most chilling, that Lady Helena had, in fact, recognised the glass that night. Whether by instinct or through some unspoken memory from her past, she knew exactly what it contained. And yet, she said nothing. She had every reason to suspect Sir Malcolm, Holmes said, given her knowledge of her husband's diplomatic enemies. The glass was a gift from the past, meant for her husband's betrayer, and she let the hand of fate pass judgment. But that is monstrous, I cried. To sit silently, knowing one of two men would die. Holmes shrugged. A calculated silence, Watson. One does not need to wield a knife to be guilty of murder in the second degree. And when the wrong man fell? She grieved, Holmes said. Perhaps sincerely, but not entirely for the reason we imagined. I found myself shuddering, not at the crime itself, but at the cold efficiency with which Holmes had peeled away every comforting illusion Lady Helena had draped around her sorrow. As Holmes concluded his reconstruction, I marvelled, as always, at how the simplest facts, the placement of a candle, a change in seating, a drop of perfume on a glove, had woven themselves into a web of politics, revenge, and unintended tragedy. Two plots, Holmes said, each independent of the other, and yet fate stitched them into a single death. The foreign agent, intending to silence Sir Malcolm, sent the glass. Lady Helena, seeing the same glass, believed it intended for her husband's enemy. Neither knew the truth, and chance placed the glass in the hand of the innocent. It is rare, Holmes added, that justice and injustice are served by the same hand. And what of Lady Helena? I asked. Her punishment, Watson, is already assured, to outlive both husband and revenge, and to know that silence can be as deadly as poison itself. With that, Holmes rose and fetched his violin, leaving me to sit alone with the uncomfortable truth that no hand in this affair was truly clean. It was after supper, with Holmes stretched languidly across his chair, that he first mentioned the memorial toast. His tone was light, almost careless, but I knew from experience that such casualness concealed the sharpest of traps. "Watson," he said, "what do you say to hosting a small gathering in Sir Charles Marbury's honour? A memorial toast, perhaps?" I looked up in surprise. "Here, at Baker Street." "Why not?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We have the space, and I dare say our drawing-room can contain all those who truly matter in this affair." Before I could protest, He was already drafting invitations. Lady Helena, of course, would attend, as would the remaining dinner guests, including Sir Malcolm Kent if Holmes's network could flush him out. "But why here?" I pressed. "Surely such things are best left to the family." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "grief may belong to the family, but truth belongs to us." With that, the matter was settled, and I realized, with no small foreboding, that the game's final act was about to begin. The guests gathered 2 days later, a somber and uneasy assembly, each one glancing at the others as though seeking reassurance they had not become suspect by association. Lady Helena stood pale and silent near the hearth, her eyes downcast, while Sir Malcolm, having been located in a remote seaside village, arrived gaunt and haunted, his usual bravado entirely absent. Holmes presided with a certain ceremonial grace, producing, with a flourish, a crystal glass, identical to the one Lady Helena had brought to us on that first morning. I could not suppress a shudder at its sudden appearance, though Holmes himself handled it with the indifference of a man holding a teacup. "We shall toast Sir Charles," Holmes announced, "with a glass as fine as the one from which he last drank." A murmur swept the room, a ripple of discomfort that Holmes observed with the eye of a hawk. Some glanced nervously at the glass, while others merely raised their brows at Holmes's theatrical touch. Only the maid, Lady Helena's trembling servant, reacted with abject horror, her hands clasped tightly to her mouth. Holmes's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. The trap had sprung, and the first prey had stumbled into it. The moment Holmes lifted the glass to propose the toast, the maid gave a strangled cry and fell back against the wall, her face ashen and her eyes wide with terror. Lady Helena rushed to her side, but the poor girl could barely stand, her breathing ragged. Holmes made no move to assist, merely setting the glass back upon the table with exaggerated care. "Curious," he murmured. "It appears that the memory of this glass is more potent than the wine it once held." I drew the maid into a chair, offering her a glass of water, but her hands shook so violently that most of it splashed onto her apron. "There is nothing to fear, my dear," I assured her. "The glass is harmless. It is but a replica." Holmes's gaze never left her face. "Yet," he said softly, "some memories refuse to be buried, even when the original sin is safely in the grave." The maid's sobs filled the silence that followed. She knew something far beyond servants' gossip, and Holmes, with the patience of a predator, intended to hear it all. It took only a few minutes, and Holmes's peculiar mixture of gentleness and absolute authority to unlock the truth from the trembling girl. Her confession came in fractured bursts, each word dragged from her by the weight of guilt and fear. She had, she admitted, placed the fatal glass at Sir Charles's seat that night, but not of her own choosing. Someone had instructed her, guiding her hand with whispered certainty. "It must go there," the voice had said. "No mistake, no deviation, that glass alone." "But who gave the order?" I asked, leaning forward. The maid's eyes flicked briefly toward Lady Helena, who stood rigid as stone, her hands clasped so tightly I saw her knuckles whiten. "No one ordered it directly," the maid said, voice barely above a whisper. "It was understood. Lady Helena spoke of the seating beforehand. She said Sir Malcolm must sit at the place of honour directly across from her." "And so you followed that instruction?" Holmes prompted. The maid nodded. It was her wish. Holmes gave a soft hum of satisfaction. "Not an order, Watson, merely a suggestion strong enough to shape fate." It was a subtlety so fine, so cruelly elegant, that even I, knowing Holmes as I did, felt a shudder at its brilliance. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than the most desperate confession. Such was the silence of Lady Helena Marbury when Holmes turned his piercing gaze upon her and asked, in his most conversational tone, "You knew, didn't you?" She did not flinch, nor did she deny it outright. Instead, she lowered her head, hands clasped tightly before her, and said, "I suspected." Holmes's brow lifted. "Suspected, madam, or understood?" Her voice was scarcely above a whisper. When the glasses arrived, I recognized them for what they were, not at once, but soon enough. I knew Sir Charles had enemies, and I knew what such a gift implied. And yet, Holmes said softly, you said nothing. She lifted her head, eyes shining with unshed tears. I thought it was meant for him, she said, glancing at Sir Malcolm's empty chair. I believed it was justice, long overdue. And when your husband fell instead, she trembled. It was God's hand, not mine. No, Lady Helena, said Holmes. It was your silence, and silence, like poison, kills just as surely. I felt both pity and unease. For the first time, I saw not a grieving widow, but a woman who had gambled with fate and lost. Even as Lady Helena's trembling confession faded into silence, there came a knock at the door, sharp, urgent, and unmistakably trembling. Holmes, with the air of a man expecting an overdue guest, called out, "Come in, Sir Malcolm." The door opened to reveal a man I scarcely recognized, Sir Malcolm Kent, his once proud bearing reduced to a ghost in borrowed clothes. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken, and the hand gripping the doorframe shook as though palsied. "You sent for me," he croaked, his voice brittle with fear. "I received your note. The handwriting was unmistakable." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed. I thought it time you faced the company you abandoned." Sir Malcolm's gaze swept the room, landing at last on the replica glass still resting at Holmes's elbow. His face contorted, and for a moment I feared he might collapse. "That cursed glass," he whispered. "You know it well," said Holmes. "You arranged for it after all." "I only intended," Sir Malcolm began, but Holmes cut him off with a raised hand. "Spare us the rehearsal," Holmes said coldly. "You plotted, you fled, and you lost control. The only question left is how much you are willing to admit." With the attention of every soul in the room fixed upon him, Holmes rose and began to recount the tale, not for Sir Malcolm's benefit, but for Lady Helena, for myself, and for the grim satisfaction of tying every loose thread into an unbreakable noose. Sir Malcolm, fearing exposure for past indiscretions, sought to silence Sir Charles before the diplomat could uncover them, Holmes began. To this end, he employed an old associate, a man who procured the Merceau glass, a relic perfectly suited to his purpose. I saw Lady Helena's hand tighten upon her chair, but she said nothing. The plan was deceptively elegant. The glass, delivered anonymously, would sit at Sir Charles's place, its poison activated with his first sip. A diplomatic death, quiet and untraceable. But fate, Holmes continued, has a sense of humour. On the night of the dinner, Sir Charles and Sir Malcolm, by a whim or triviality, exchanged seats. The fatal glass passed to the wrong man, and Sir Malcolm, watching death take the seat beside him, fled like a man pursued by his own reflection. It was, in essence, your own hand you saw falling, Sir Malcolm, and you have been running from that ghost ever since. Sir Malcolm's head fell into his hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Holmes took up the glass and held it to the light, turning it slowly between his fingers. But fate was not the only hand at work, he continued, for there was a second plot, silent, subtle, and every bit as deadly. His eyes rested upon Lady Helena, whose face was pale but resolute. You, madam, had your own reasons for that glass to find its way to Sir Malcolm's seat. You knew his history. You knew his enemies. When the gift arrived, you recognized it for what it was. Not merely a gift, but a judgment. I saw her throat tighten. I said nothing, she whispered. Precisely, said Holmes. You said nothing, because you hoped the glass would find its way to the man you hated most. You were prepared to let the poisoner's hand serve your purpose. But I did not place the glass, she protested. No, Holmes agreed. You merely ensured the seating arrangement, guiding your maid's hand with gentle suggestion. You never ordered the poison. You merely allowed it. Holmes set the glass down with a soft click. Two plots, Watson, each complete in itself, yet when woven together, they formed a tragedy no man could have written. Which brings us, Holmes said, with a trace of satisfaction, to the purpose of this gathering. I had wondered, from the first, what Holmes hoped to achieve by reenacting the toast. Now at last the answer lay bare. The glass itself was never the point, Holmes explained. The trap lay in the reactions it provoked, in the hands that trembled, the breaths that caught, and the memories that climbed from shallow graves. He gestured toward Lady Helena's maid, whose collapse had been as revealing as any confession. Guilt is a curious thing, Watson. It needs only the smallest nudge to surface. Lady Helena sat rigid, her lips pressed tight. Sir Malcolm sagged in his chair, a man long past the luxury of denial. I needed only to watch, Holmes concluded. The guilty convict themselves, given time and the right stage. His methods, so coldly precise, left me both in awe and unease. He had not solved this case by deduction alone, but by stirring the human heart until it betrayed its own secrets. At last, Holmes raised the harmless replica glass and held it high, his expression unreadable. "To Sir Charles Marbury," he said, "a man who died not by one hand but by two, each believing they were alone." No one joined the toast. Lady Helena stared into the hearth, and Sir Malcolm could not meet Holmes's gaze. The glass remained untasted. After the guests departed, Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "A curious case, Watson. Not a murder, but a collaboration, unspoken and unseen." I shook my head. "Do you believe either will face justice?" "Justice," said Holmes, "is already served. One will live with her silence, and the other with his cowardice. No prison could match those sentences." And with that, Holmes set the glass back upon the table and reached for his violin. The case was closed, yet the taste of its truth lingered, bitter as arsenic on the tongue. There are few moments I cherish more than those rare occasions when Sherlock Holmes rises before an assembled audience to deliver his final dissection of a case. That curious blend of theatre, intellect, and razor-sharp wit which transforms deduction into performance art. It is in these moments, with all the facts laid bare, that Holmes ceases to be merely a detective and becomes, in my eyes, a sort of professor of human folly, standing at his lectern before a class forever destined to fall short of his brilliance. On this occasion, the audience was smaller than usual. Lady Helena, pale but composed, Sir Malcolm, hollow-eyed and trembling, and myself, notebook in hand, fully prepared to be astonished once more. Holmes stood at the mantel, fingers steepled before him, his gaze moving languidly between the two central players in this deadly drama. "You each brought your own hand to this tragedy," Holmes began. "Yet neither knew you were collaborators in murder. Two separate plots, bound by a single poisoned glass." He paused, as if savouring the silence before the first curtain fell. "Shall I show you the invisible threads that tied you together?" Holmes's first revelation concerned a detail so minute I might never have considered it evidence at all. The faint, fleeting scent of vinegar which Holmes had detected on Lady Helena's gloves the very morning she arrived at Baker Street. "Vinegar, Watson," Holmes said, turning to me, "has long been a reliable companion to those seeking to cleanse delicate surfaces, particularly glass, of any trace of handling." Lady Helena's fingers twitched in her lap, but she said nothing. "Such cleansing," Holmes continued, "is rarely required unless one has handled something one wishes not to be traced to one's hand. Say, a glass recently associated with sudden and suspicious death." I glanced at Lady Helena, whose complexion had grown even paler. "Surely," I said, "she might have simply wished to clean it for propriety's sake." "Indeed," said Holmes, "but propriety seldom leaves fingerprints to be wiped away, unless the hand that held it knew its true nature before the fatal sip was taken." It was a chillingly subtle detail, one invisible to the naked eye, yet perfumed in guilt. Holmes turned next to the table itself, that innocent stage upon which the final tragedy unfolded. As ever, his eyes had seen more than mere cutlery and crystal. They had seen the story told by the setting itself. The placement of the glass, Holmes said, was no accident. The servant who set it there believed she was following the house's usual order. Yet her hand was guided by suggestion, not command. Lady Helena flinched slightly at that, and Holmes's smile was thin. But more curious than the glass was the alignment of the place settings themselves. I observed, during our visit to the Marbury residence, the faintest scuff marks where the tablecloth had been hurriedly adjusted. I stared at him. "You mean the seating was changed?" "Precisely," said Holmes. "Sir Charles, it seems, found his original seat uncomfortable in the candlelight and exchanged it for Sir Malcolm's. A minor whim, and one that turned a plot into a catastrophe." Holmes tapped the side of his nose. "Always, Watson, the smallest deviations are the ones that end lives." Having laid bare the human errors, Holmes turned his attention to the glass itself, the silent witness to all that had transpired. On our second examination of the fatal goblet, Holmes had placed it beneath the candle's flickering flame, studying it with a jeweller's eye. "Crystal speaks, Watson," he said, "if one knows how to listen." Under the warmth of the candlelight, the inner surface of the glass revealed a faint, oily discoloration. Invisible in ordinary light, but clear enough under the right conditions. This, Holmes said, was the final proof of Merceau's deadly craftsmanship. A subtle inner coating, infused with a compound that reacts not to liquid, but to the warmth of human lips. I shuddered. So the glass itself killed Sir Charles. "It did," Holmes agreed, "but only because it was placed in the wrong hand." There was something deeply unsettling in the way Holmes spoke of the glass, as though it were a conspirator in its own crime, holding its secret until the precise moment when death was required, and then, like any good assassin, disappearing into silence. Holmes paused, then delivered the final revelation, the thread that tied both plots together, the origin of the glass itself. It had not simply been chosen at random, nor had it been purchased by either conspirator. Its arrival had been arranged by a third hand, one unseen but intimately familiar with Sir Charles's work. The glass, Holmes said, was sent by an agent whose name we shall never know, one who bore a grudge not against Sir Charles, but against Sir Malcolm Kent. Sir Malcolm stirred uneasily in his seat. "You were the intended victim," Holmes said calmly. "The glass was sent to ensure your silence, not his." The room fell silent. But when Lady Helena recognized the glass, Holmes continued, she assumed it was meant for Sir Charles, a gift from his own enemies. And so, by ensuring Sir Malcolm sat at the place of honour, she unwittingly rearranged a murder intended for one man into a tragedy for another. The invisible hand had sent the glass, but the final blow had been delivered by a widow's silence and a guilty man's cowardice. And thus, Holmes concluded, the deadliest hand at the table was fate itself. Holmes's fingers rested lightly upon the glass as though it were a fragile creature he had coaxed from hiding. His gaze, however, was fixed upon Lady Helena and Sir Malcolm alike, two conspirators who never conspired, yet whose separate intentions had converged upon the same fatal moment. "Consider the symmetry of it, Watson," Holmes said softly. "Two minds, driven by vastly different motives, aiming at the same man across the dinner table. Sir Malcolm sought to silence a potential enemy. Lady Helena hoped fate would silence an old betrayer." He turned the glass slowly between his fingers. "Neither of you spoke to the other, yet you collaborated in silence. Sir Malcolm arranged the delivery. Lady Helena shaped the seating. Each acted independently, yet their actions wove into a single cord, tightening around Sir Charles's throat." The silence in the room deepened, broken only by Holmes's voice. And so, a man who was never the intended target drank from a glass meant for someone else. A death born not from malice alone, but from the interplay of silence and fear. Holmes set the glass down, its soft chime ringing like a bell for the dead, and I could not help but shudder. Lady Helena's hands gripped her handkerchief so tightly I feared it might tear, yet her voice, when she spoke, was eerily calm. "I did nothing," she said softly. "I placed no poison, gave no order. All I did was nothing." Holmes inclined his head. "And yet, madam, it is precisely that nothing which shaped the tragedy." He gestured toward the table. "You knew what that glass could be. You saw the danger. You had every opportunity to speak, to warn, to stop. Yet you chose silence, not out of innocence, but out of hope. You hoped the glass would find its way to the man you despised most." Her breath caught in her throat. "He deserved it," she whispered. "After all he did to my husband." "Perhaps," Holmes said quietly. "But the line between justice and vengeance is thin indeed, and you left fate to choose your weapon." It was, I thought, the cruelest twist of all. A woman who wished to see her enemy fall, but could not soil her own hands. And so, like a gambler afraid to roll the dice, she placed her bet on silence, and lost. "And yet," Holmes said, "there is one hand we cannot seize, one shadow that slips between the lines of our story." He rose and walked to the window, gazing out into the London fog. "The sender of the glass, the true architect, remains unseen." Sir Malcolm's head snapped up. "You mean the agent who sent it?" "Precisely," Holmes said. "A man, or woman, whose grievance with Sir Malcolm predated this dinner by years. They delivered the instrument of death into this house, but never lifted the glass themselves. They remained, as they intended, a ghost in the fog." I frowned. "But surely your methods—" Holmes raised a hand. "Some ghosts choose to remain unseen, Watson. They operate through suggestion, implication, and gifts placed in trembling hands. This one will vanish back into the mist, satisfied that vengeance was served, even if the wrong man fell." I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. There was something chilling about a villain who knew when to step back, who trusted others' silence, guilt, and fear to finish the crime for them. "Some crimes," Holmes said, "require no hand at all." The guests departed soon after, leaving Holmes and me alone with the remnants of the evening, the glass, the candle's stub, and my ever-growing sense of exasperation. "Holmes," I said, pacing the room, "you knew, didn't you? From the very beginning, when Lady Helena first arrived, you knew she was hiding something." Holmes stretched out upon the settee, his fingers laced across his chest. "A suspicion, nothing more." "But you said nothing to me," I exclaimed. "You let me bumble along, believing her a frightened widow, while you calmly waited for her own silence to betray her." Holmes's smile was maddeningly serene. "What value is there, my dear Watson, in telling a man the answer before the riddle is fully formed?" "You do enjoy tormenting me," I grumbled. "On the contrary," said Holmes, "I merely prefer that you arrive at the truth by your own path, even if it takes you the longer road." I could only shake my head, caught once more between admiration and irritation, a condition, I fear, that defines my entire association with Sherlock Holmes. As I stood by the fire, still nursing my bruised pride, I glanced at Holmes, and there it was, that infuriating smile I had come to know so well. A smile that held no triumph, no gloating, but rather the quiet amusement of a man who sees the world for what it is and chooses to be entertained by it. "You never truly answered me," I said. "Did you suspect her from the start?" Holmes reached for his violin, plucking idly at the strings. "Does it matter?" "It does to me." He gave no reply, only that same smile, as though the answer was too elementary to deserve utterance. And with that, he drew the bow across the strings, filling the room with a melancholy melody that drifted into the London fog, leaving me, as ever, one step behind the man who saw everything. The last of our guests had departed, and the hour grew late. Holmes, settled in his armchair with a slender curl of smoke rising from his pipe, appeared utterly at ease, as though the extraordinary sequence of revelations had been nothing more than a passing diversion. I poured 2 small glasses of brandy and took my accustomed seat opposite him. The gaslights flickered softly, casting elongated shadows along the walls, while outside, the London fog clung thickly to the window panes, like some spectral observer reluctant to leave. "An unusual case," I said at last, breaking the silence. "Unusual?" Holmes arched a brow. "On the contrary, Watson, it was a most typical affair, wherein the flaws of human character provided the only certainty." Holmes's dismissal did little to dampen my own sense of unease. "What troubles me," I said, "is not the crime itself, but what it reveals, the delicate fragility of diplomacy, and the ease with which personal vendettas bleed into affairs of state." He regarded me with amusement. "My dear Watson, you are waxing philosophical." "And why not?" I countered. "Sir Charles perished not by the hand of a single enemy, but from the intersecting fears, silences, and ambitions of multiple players, each unaware of the other. How is trust possible when even a dinner toast conceals a dagger?" Holmes shrugged lightly. "Diplomacy," he said, "has always been a polite veneer for war. The only surprise here is that you expected better of it." His words, though lightly spoken, carried a bitter truth. Holmes reached across to the table and took the poisoned goblet in his fingers. He turned it slowly, studying the way the light fractured through the crystal, his expression contemplative. "Curious," he murmured. "Such fine craftsmanship. Yet even the most delicate glass conceals a flaw, if one knows where to look." I watched him, wondering if he spoke of the goblet or of the people who had held it. "Everything we have uncovered," he continued, "was there from the very first moment Lady Helena unwrapped it. All that followed, the deaths, the betrayals, the revelations, they were merely the logical outcome of a single crack in the crystal." He set the glass down again, as though it no longer interested him. Sensing the philosophical turn of his mood, I seized the opportunity to make a familiar proposal. "After such a case," I said, "surely a few days' rest is warranted. A change of scenery, perhaps a quiet cottage by the sea." Holmes gave me the kind of pitying look one reserves for a well-meaning but misguided child. "My dear Watson," he said, "the cure for exertion is not idleness, but further exertion. What you call rest I would find intolerable." I sighed, well accustomed to his refusal. Holmes would no more take a holiday than a clock would cease ticking for the sake of leisure. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers once more steepled beneath his chin, and allowed himself the faintest smile. "Besides," he added, "we may not have the luxury of repose." A telegram arrived this evening, just before Lady Helena's departure. I raised my brows. "A case? Possibly. It is signed only C, a single letter, but enough to conjure a familiar face. The Countess, whose entanglements with Holmes had provided no shortage of intrigue and frustration in the past." Holmes's smile deepened. "It seems, my dear Watson, that fate has set the table for us once again." Holmes reached once more for the crystal glass, lifting it lightly between finger and thumb. The light caught in its polished curves, but I could not help but see, behind the shimmer, the ghost of its deadly purpose. He raised it slightly, as though offering a toast to the invisible hand that set our latest case in motion. "It is remarkable, Watson," he said, "how often the greatest secrets rest at the bottom of an innocent glass." And with that, he set it down once more, just another piece in the great museum of human folly that was 221B Baker Street. Holmes stood by the mantel, the crystal goblet resting in his hand, like a fragile relic salvaged from a shipwreck. He turned it slowly, as though the glass might confess its secrets if coaxed gently enough. "You see, Watson," he said, "the deadliest poisons are rarely those we can detect in a laboratory. They are the poisons of silence, of unspoken grievances, of men and women who choose to say nothing when speaking might save a life." I nodded, reflecting on Lady Helena's silence, Sir Malcolm's treachery, and the ghostly hand that had sent the goblet in the first place. Holmes set the glass down and added with a faint smile, "It is curious how often the simplest of objects, a single glass at dinner, can reveal not one crime, but two opposing schemes, each oblivious to the other. And yet, it was neither scheme that killed Sir Charles. No, Watson, it was chance itself, the uncontrollable variable that makes the detective's work both maddening and sublime." Holmes tapped the glass thoughtfully, then glanced at me. "Now tell me, Watson, what do you suppose was the greatest mistake in this case? Was it Lady Helena's silence, Sir Malcolm's cowardice, or the unseen sender's faith in human nature?" He smiled, but gave no answer, leaving the question to hang in the air like the mist curling outside our window. What do you think, dear reader? In this tangle of diplomacy, vengeance, and deception, which fatal mistake set the whole tragedy into motion? Share your deductions in the comments below. And if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures. And if you have fellow mystery lovers in your life, pass along this tale and let them join in solving the case themselves. After all, as Holmes himself might say, the game is always afoot.